And finally, I invite Dr. Stephen Law to come and present his final summing up.
I started out by pointing out that as we look back across the hundreds of millions of years of sentient life on this planet, we find suffering on a stupendous scale. For example, we humans have, over many hundreds of thousands of generations, had to watch a third to a half of our children die painfully in our arms. Immense suffering and horror are built into the fabric of the world we are forced to inhabit. My contention is that this suffering does constitute powerful observational evidence against Professor Craig's God. Even many Christians acknowledge it constitutes a very powerful intellectual threat to their belief. I've challenged Professor Craig to explain why, given this mountain of evidence, belief in his good God is supported by the evidence and arguments. In particular, why is belief in his good God better supported than belief in an evil God, which is clearly absurd, which clearly is undermined by observation of the world around us? Who believes in an evil God? Nobody. Why not? Take a look around you. Professor Craig has spectacularly failed to meet this challenge. He's tried to explain the mountain of suffering, of course. He appealed to the promise of an afterlife, but mostly he's just played the mystery card, played the skeptical card, insisting that God has his good reasons for unleashing hundreds of thousands of years of horror. It's just that we're not in a position to know what they are. Well, right, okay. I pointed out these explanations can be used just as effectively to deal with the evidence against the evil God hypothesis. So obviously they failed to show that belief in a good God is better supported than belief in an evil God. Those moves are neutral. So Professor Craig is now going to have to rely on his arguments for a good God if he's to balance things up at all, if it's to show that his belief is more reasonable than a belief in an evil God. But only two of his arguments are actually even relevant, so I ignored the first one. These are the arguments that he did offer for his good God were remarkably weak. He offered a moral argument, but such moral arguments, as I pointed out, are rejected by the vast majority of moral philosophers. Even Richard Swinburne thinks Craig's moral argument fails. But I wasn't relying on that for authority. I just pointed out that Professor Craig provided no justification for the first premise of the argument, and he still hasn't. He still hasn't provided a decent justification for the first premise of the argument. The argument has a very dubious first premise. If there's no God, there are no objective moral values. Why should we believe that? There's been no argument. But even if he could show that it was true, I pointed out he would not have succeeded in showing that belief in his God is reasonable. More reasonable than belief, significantly more reasonable than belief in an evil God. For of course, when placed next to a mountain of observational evidence that there's no such God, his moral argument merely generates the conclusion that there are no more objective moral values, a conclusion that, while counterintuitive, can't just be assumed. So in fact, Craig's moral argument kind of presupposes that he's already dealt with the evidential problem of evil. You can't use it against, as a counterbalance to, the evidential problem of evil. His other argument was the resurrection argument, which is, frankly, almost comically flimsy. Even many Christians, including Alvin Plantinga, and again, this is not an appeal to authority, just to illustrate the point, consider it terribly weak. So let's not lose sight of the weight of argument and evidence on either side of this debate. There is a mountain of observational evidence against Craig's God. He has signally failed to explain that evidence away. He's just played the mystery card. He offered a couple of arguments for his particular God, but they turned out to be at best, well, weedy. Indeed, both have high-profile Christian critics. The moral argument relied on a premise for which we've seen no decent argument whatsoever. So I think it is indeed spectacularly clear where the balance of probability lies. We may not know why the universe exists, but we can quite reasonably rule certain answers out, such as that an evil God created it. We all know that. We can, for much the same sort of reasons, observational reasons, quite reasonably also rule out the suggestion that Professor Craig's good God created it. That's the end. If any of you want to explore the kind of argument I've sketched out tonight, please take a look at my paper, The Evil God Challenge, which is in Religion. That's another one. We were talking about Professor Craig's God. In Religious Studies 2010, there's also a condensed version of this argument in my most recent book, should you wish to purchase it. Okay, thank you very much.